Think you know the whole story? Turns out you were probably taught the half-truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Close your eyes. Picture your 10th grade history classroom. You can probably smell the chalk dust and the laminate on the textbook cover. Open that book to the chapter on the French Revolution. There's almost certainly a portrait of a woman with powdered hair piled high, a silk dress, and a look of vague, aristocratic boredom. Her name is Marie Antoinette. And you know the one thing you're supposed to remember about her. It's the quote, the one that defines her, the one that, in 4 little words, sums up everything that was wrong with the French monarchy. The scene is set. Paris is starving. The price of bread, the absolute staple of life for the common person, has skyrocketed. There are riots in the streets. A wave of desperation and anger is building into a tsunami. Back in the gilded, glittering halls of the Palace of Versailles, a courtier, wringing his hands, approaches the queen. "Your Majesty," he says, "the people are suffering. They have no bread." And the queen, without looking up from her cards or her tiny dog, tilts her head and says, "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche, let them eat cake." It's perfect. It's the most cold-blooded, out-of-touch, cartoonishly evil thing a person could possibly say. It's the kind of line that starts a revolution. It's the line that perfectly justifies the sharpening of the guillotine blade. We hear it, and we nod. Of course. That's why they overthrew her. She was a monster. This story is baked into our cultural consciousness. We see it in movies, we hear it in documentaries. It's used as a political shorthand for any politician who seems disconnected from the struggles of an average person. It's not just a history lesson, it's a parable. But this is Half-Truths, and we are here to pull the thread on the stories that seem just a little too perfect, the sound bites that are almost too clean, because when a story sums up a complex historical event that neatly, it's almost always a sign that we're not getting the whole story. So, what if the most famous quote attributed to Marie Antoinette, the line that sealed her fate in the popular imagination, was a lie? What if she never said it? And what if the real story tells us something far more fascinating and far more terrifying about the power of propaganda? Let's start by painting the picture we all know. The story of Let Them Eat Cake is compelling because it's so simple. It's a fable of arrogance and comeuppance. On one side, you have the people, starving, noble in their suffering, desperate for a crust of bread. On the other, you have the queen, foreign, frivolous, decadent, dripping in jewels, and utterly clueless, living in a fantasy world of opulent palaces and manicured gardens. In this story, Marie Antoinette is the ultimate symbol of the ancient regime, the old order. She was the Austrian whore, as the pamphlets called her, a foreigner from the rival Habsburg dynasty who had been shipped to France at 14 to secure a political alliance. She was famous for her extravagant spending, her elaborate hairstyles, her perceived influence over her husband, the weak-willed King Louis XVI. She famously had a fake peasant village built on the grounds of Versailles, the Hameau de la Reine, where she and her ladies-in-waiting could play at being milkmaids. To the starving population of Paris, this wasn't just eccentric. It was a grotesque mockery of their suffering. So, when the revolution finally explodes in 1789, she is the perfect target. The king might be indecisive, but she is seen as the malicious force, the one whispering in his ear, the one bleeding the country dry for her own pleasures. And then comes the quote, "It's the kill shot. They have no bread. Let them eat cake." It's a story that needs no explanation. It confirms every suspicion, every rumor, every bit of hatred that had been festering for years. It's the final proof that the monarchy is not just incompetent, but actively cruel. It's a death sentence delivered in a single callous quip. This is the story we were all taught. It's clean, it's memorable, and it makes the bloody, chaotic, and morally complex French Revolution feel simple. It gives us a clear villain, and it gives the revolutionaries a righteous cause. It's a fantastic story. It's just not true. The first thread we have to pull is the source. For a quote this explosive, a quote that supposedly defined a queen and sparked a revolution, you would expect it to be everywhere at the time. You'd expect revolutionaries to be screaming it in the streets. You'd expect it to be in the newspapers, in the charges leveled against her, in the trial records. Here's the problem, it's not. There is not a single shred of contemporary evidence, not one letter, not one diary, not one court document, not one credible newspaper report that links Marie Antoinette to the phrase, "let them eat cake," during her lifetime. Think about that. The most inflammatory, damning quote of the era, and nobody thought to write it down at the time. The revolutionary propagandists, who were masters of character assassination, somehow missed the single greatest piece of anti-royal propaganda. It doesn't add up. The quote wasn't even used against her at her trial in 1793. And believe me, they threw everything they had at her. The prosecution scraped the bottom of the barrel. They accused her of treason, of bankrupting the nation, and most grotesquely, of sexually abusing her own son. They were desperate to convict her. If this cake quote had been in circulation, if there was even a rumor she had said it, it would have been Exhibit A for the prosecution. But it's nowhere to be found. So, where did the story come from? This is where it gets really interesting. The phrase, or one very much like it, was floating around France long before Marie Antoinette even set foot in the country. The true source is almost certainly the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In 1767, Rousseau was writing his Confessions, his autobiography. In Book 6, he tells a story from his youth, decades earlier. He had stolen some wine and was looking for bread to go with it, but he was too finely dressed to go into a common bakery. And I quote, "At length I remembered the last resort of a great princess who, when told that the peasants had no bread, replied, 'Then let them eat pastry.'" Now, let's look at the dates. Rousseau wrote this passage around 1767. Marie Antoinette arrived in France as a 14-year-old child in 1770. She didn't become queen until 1774. It is chronologically impossible for Rousseau to have been writing about Marie Antoinette. So who was this great princess? Rousseau doesn't say. Historians have speculated it might have been Maria Theresa, the wife of Louis XIV, who lived a full century earlier. Others think it was one of the daughters of Louis XV. But the most likely answer is that it wasn't a specific person at all. The story of the clueless royal, suggesting an expensive alternative to bread, was a piece of folk myth. It was an urban legend, a type of story that gets told and retold, with the villain's name changing depending on who is most unpopular at the time. It was the arrogant aristocrat story, a piece of folklore designed to illustrate the gap between the rulers and the ruled. So, we have a pre-existing, unattached smear story. And we have a queen who is deeply, profoundly unpopular. How do the two get stuck together? The answer is propaganda. Vicious, relentless, and incredibly effective propaganda. Long before the Revolution, Marie Antoinette was the target of a massive smear campaign. This was conducted through libels, illegal, pornographic, and satirical pamphlets that were the 18th century equivalent of a combination of supermarket tabloids and the darkest corners of the internet. These libels accused her of everything. They depicted her as a sexual deviant, a lesbian, an adulterer, a traitor selling French secrets to her Austrian family, and above all, a spendthrift who was bankrupting the nation. She was Madame Veto for encouraging the king to block popular reforms. She was the Austrian whore. She was a monster. This campaign was designed to dehumanize her, to turn her from a person into a symbol of everything that was rotten in France. And it worked. By the time the revolution began, her reputation was already destroyed. The public was primed to believe literally anything bad about her. The "let them eat cake" quote doesn't appear in print associated with her until decades after her death. It was in the 1840s, a full half-century after she was executed, that a writer named Alphonse Karr definitively pinned the quote to her. By then, the revolution was a distant memory. She was a safe historical boogeyman. The story was just too good, and she was the most logical person to pin it on. It was the final, posthumous victory of the libels. They had created a caricature so powerful that it absorbed this floating piece of folklore, and the fusion became the fact that we all know today. We also have to talk about the word itself. The French phrase is qu'ils mangent de la brioche. She didn't say gâteau, which is cake. She supposedly said brioche. Brioche isn't a frosted 3-layer birthday cake. It's a rich bread made with plenty of butter, eggs, and a bit of sugar. Now, this doesn't actually absolve her. The sentiment is the same. To a person starving because they can't afford a 4-sou loaf of coarse, dark bread, suggesting they eat a 20-sou loaf of rich, buttery brioche is just as insulting. The cruelty and the cluelessness are identical. But the English translation, "let them eat cake," adds a layer of pop culture frivolity. It gives us images of frosting and confetti, of Sofia Coppola's candy-colored movie. It heightens the sense of detachment, turning a political failure into a personal, almost girlish flight of fancy. So, if she wasn't the monster who casually dismissed starvation, who was she? The truth, as it so often is far more complex and far less satisfying than the myth. The real Marie Antoinette was not a brilliant political thinker. She was not a saint. She was a product of her environment. She was a teenager, shipped off to a foreign, notoriously decadent, and deeply strange court. The Palace of Versailles was a bubble, an ecosystem of ritual and gossip, almost completely detached from the reality of life in the rest of France. Was she out of touch? Absolutely. How could she not be? Everyone at Versailles was. But was she uniquely cruel? The evidence points in the other direction. We actually have her letters, and in them, she writes with what appears to be genuine concern for the poor. In one letter, written during a bread shortage, she wrote, "It is certain that in seeing the people who treat us so well despite their own misfortune, we are more bound than ever to work for their happiness." There are also contemporary accounts of her engaging in charity, sponsoring orphans, and even, according to one story, rushing to the aid of a peasant who had been gored by a stag during a royal hunt, paying for his medical care and supporting his family. This is not the portrait of a woman who would hear that her people are starving and respond with a cruel joke. This is the portrait of a woman who, within the suffocating constraints of her role, understood the concept of noblesse oblige, the duty of the nobility to care for the less fortunate. She was a paternalistic aristocrat, not a sociopath. Her real crimes in the eyes of the public were different. She spent lavishly at a time of national debt, though her spending was a drop in the ocean compared to, say, the cost of France's involvement in the American Revolution. She was a foreigner from a rival nation, and she was a woman who dared to have political opinions and her own social circle, which was seen as a usurpation of the king's authority. She was the perfect scapegoat. She was the lightning rod for a century of popular fury against a broken system, and the cake, quote, was the tool that helped forge that lightning rod. So why do we cling to this story? Why, more than 200 years later, do we all know that Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake," even though all the evidence says she didn't? It's because the French Revolution is big, messy, and confusing. It's a complex story about tax policy, class warfare, harvest failures, Enlightenment philosophy, and geopolitical conflict. It's hard to fit all of that into a single, compelling narrative. But let them eat cake, that's easy. That's a story a child can understand. It's good versus evil. It's the starving poor versus the wicked queen. The half-truth, the myth, survived because it is useful. It serves a narrative purpose. It simplifies the complex. It gives a face to a system of oppression. The revolution needed Marie Antoinette to be that monster. It was the moral justification for the guillotine. In the end, this isn't really about saving the reputation of a long-dead queen. The ancient regime was a deeply unjust and unequal system, and the revolution, for all its horrors, was born from legitimate and profound suffering. What this is about is understanding how history is written, or more accurately, how it is constructed. It shows us how a good story, a powerful soundbite, a viral piece of propaganda can become more real than the truth. It proves that a lie, if it's sharp enough and simple enough, can echo for centuries, drowning out all the messy, complicated, and human details that make up the real story. The quote is a ghost, a piece of political theater that we've mistaken for a historical document. The real Marie Antoinette, a flawed, complicated, and ultimately tragic figure, was tried, convicted, and executed by a tribunal in 1793. But her caricature, the one built from pamphlets and rumors and a misplaced piece of folklore, was so powerful and so useful, it became immortal. Now you know the real story. What other half-truths are still out there? If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time. Until then, stay curious.